The story of Karbala is one of the most misunderstood moments in Islamic history, surrounded by legends and myths with very few accounts verifiably transmitted. Yet it's become a religion to some and a traumatic moment for others. And at the center of it all is perhaps the most vilified person in all of Islamic history. This is the story of the first Umayyad rulers, from the Caliphate of Muawiyah to the Kingdom of Yazid. And inshallah, all of the questions and misconceptions will be answered, and perhaps you will realize that there was more to the story than what you may have originally thought. Because while Karbala was a great tragedy, an even greater one would soon follow when the entire city of Medina was put under siege, and what happened next is almost impossible to retell.
Banu Umayya.
Long before the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, his great-grandfather Hashim was entrusted with the responsibility of feeding the pilgrims in Mecca and organizing the yearly Hajj. And with his high position, as well as his wealth and his status, he managed to convince the Arabs to cooperate in a collective trade route flowing from Yemen to Syria, with Mecca in the center. This trade route would be known as the caravan of the winter and summer, رحلة الشتاء والصيف, and it would bring untold wealth to the people of Mecca. And because of this, Hashim would rise within his society, being given a prestige and status that no one else had. And soon he would become one of the great leaders of the Arabian Peninsula. But this success and his prestige didn't go uncontested, and soon someone from within his own family would try to outshine him. Hashim's twin brother Abd had a son by the name of Umayya. And whenever Umayya would hear of Hashim's success, he grew envious of him and would try to outdo him, holding larger banquets, giving more to the pilgrims, and showing off a greater display of wealth. But eventually, this competition grew more hostile, and Umayya publicly challenged Hashim to a contest of boasting. These contests were known as munaffara, with each side reciting poetry and giving speeches to brag about their own lineage and accomplishments while putting the other side down. It was almost like an ancient form of a rap battle, but the stakes were much, much higher. But Umayya soon lost, and as part of the terms of the battle, he was forced to give 50 camels to Hashim and leave the city for 10 years in exile. This battle of boasting may have seemed insignificant at the time, but both Hashim and Umayya's children would grow into clans within the Quraysh, and a rivalry between the two would persist long after Islam came to the region and the Prophet ﷺ lived and passed away. These two clans were known as Banu Umayya and Banu Hashim. And whenever one side managed to gain prestige and clout, the other side had to try to outdo them and bring something even bigger or better. They competed in charity and hospitality and in feeding the pilgrims. They competed in diplomatic relationships with other tribes to see who could make the biggest deals. But eventually Banu Hashim came with something that Banu Umayya could simply never come up with: a prophet from Allah would be a guide for all of the people of this world. And at that, many of the leaders of Banu Umayya became extremely jealous, and they refused to believe in Islam. How could they follow a prophet of Allah when he came from the rival clan? The exception to this rule, of course, was Uthman ibn Affan, who became one of the earliest converts to Islam. And he went on against the rest of Banu Umayya and dedicated his life and his wealth to the cause. But most of Banu Umayya only became Muslim after the conquest of Mecca, when they finally realized that Islam was victorious and they knew that there was no point in resisting. And among them, of course, was Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, the leader of Banu Umayya and the father of Muawiyah. He had become the default ruler of all of Mecca, while the rest of the Qurayshi leaders had died in the Battle of Badr. But now that he had submitted himself to Islam, he decided to prove his loyalty and make up for all of those years that he had fought against the Prophet ﷺ. And so he joined the Prophet ﷺ in the Battle of Hunayn, and with him was Muawiyah and Yazid, his other son. Together they fought valiantly against the enemies of Islam, and Abu Sufyan even lost an eye in fighting. But when the Muslims were finally victorious that day, the Prophet ﷺ gave both Abu Sufyan and Muawiyah a gift: 100 camels each, a mini fortune to soften their hearts towards Islam and to reward them for overcoming their arrogance against Banu Hashim. But Banu Umayyah's new loyalty to Islam didn't stop at the death of the Prophet ﷺ. They continued to serve the Muslims under Abu Bakr and Omar, joining the conquests of Syria and Palestine in fighting against the Romans. In the Battle of Yarmouk, Abu Sufyan lost his second eye, becoming blind in his old age. But as for Yazid and Muawiyah, they continued to fight on until eventually these lands were taken by the Muslims. Abu Bakr then appointed Yazid the governor of Syria, owing to his talent for diplomacy. But Yazid soon died from a plague and he was replaced by his brother Muawiyah. And Muawiyah would go on to be the only governor who was never removed from his position. There, Muawiyah served for 22 years under the caliphates of Omar and Uthman. And during that time, the people of Syria became extremely loyal to him as he had ruled over them effectively with a level of justice they had never seen before. And so it's no surprise when Ali became the Khalifa, the people of Syria supported Muawiyah over him and were even willing to fight a war on Muawiyah's behalf. Soon after the first Fitna, Ali passed away and his son Hassan became the next Khalifa. But Hassan preferred to step down and to prevent another civil war from happening. And so he gave up his caliphate and handed it to Muawiyah. And Muawiyah now became the undisputed leader of the Muslims, and once more the caliphate was united. And because another civil war had been averted, the people celebrated that year, calling it Aam al-Jama'ah, the year of unity.
Most books you'll find on Islamic history are extremely bland and boring and often hard to read. And so that's why I've paid special attention to the storytelling in the book that I'm writing called The Entire History of Islam. Islamic history is full of emotional moments, from the glory the Muslims would have felt that day when they conquered Constantinople to the great misery and fear that they felt when the Mongols invaded their lands. These were moments of joy and jubilation, and these were moments of extreme sadness and depression. Heroes that brought victory and justice to the land, and villains that massacred the people and brought destruction to their people. And when we read through these stories, we need to understand the emotions that they were going through as well. We need to understand the fear that Umar ibn al-Khattab had when he was given responsibility over the ummah. No longer did he have the Prophet ﷺ who was receiving direct revelation from Allah. He was on his own with the weight of the world on his hands. And we need to understand the joy and the jubilation that those Muslims would have felt as they finally liberated the city of Jerusalem after 100 years in the hands of the Crusaders. This is what I've been trying to bring the ummah over the last 5 years with my videos on TikTok and YouTube. I've written hundreds of stories about the Muslim ummah, and I will be applying those same storytelling techniques that I've learned over those years to this book, so that when you read this book, you too will feel what your ancestors felt as they were overcoming the most dire of circumstances. So go to my website now and pre-order the book. And if you pre-order the book, I will literally write your name into the book, an honor for you, because you were one of the very first people to support this project.
The Kingdom of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan.
Although Muawiyah was nowhere near the ranks of the rightly guided Khalifas, he was still one of the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ, and he was even given a number of special virtues. Most of the reports say that Muawiyah converted to Islam at the conquest of Mecca, but there is one report which may suggest that he converted 2 years earlier, but had kept his Islam secret. Muawiyah once said, "The Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, entered Mecca during the Umrah al-Qada, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and I believed in him. Then when the year of the conquest of Mecca began, I declared my conversion to Islam, and so I came to him and he welcomed me, and I wrote the Quran in his presence." Writing the Quran in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ was one of the most prestigious tasks given to a Muslim. He was taking the recitation of the Prophet ﷺ and preserving it in ink. And to be chosen for this task, not only did he need to be highly educated, but the Prophet ﷺ must have also had a high level of trust for him as well. One of the reasons for the Prophet ﷺ's trust in him may have been the fact that Muawiyah was his own brother-in-law. You see, Muawiyah's own sister, Habib, was one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, and through that connection, Muawiyah was a part of the family of the Prophet ﷺ, and from that, of course, a bond would have grown between them. There's no doubt that the Prophet ﷺ wanted good for Muawiyah, and he believed that he would rise to become a great leader. After all, his father, Abu Sufyan, had been the ruler of Mecca, and all of the rest of Banu Umayya had been heavily involved in politics. And so, the Prophet ﷺ made a special dua for him, asking Allah to make Muawiyah a guide for the people and for him to be given guidance. O Allah, make him a guide who is himself rightly guided, and guide others through him. These are some of the many virtues of Muawiyah, and they are the reason why we don't doubt his character. But despite these virtues, there are a number of strange decisions that he took during his reign, and many people can't help but wonder, what was their purpose? Under Muawiyah, the governors became inaccessible, and the people were not able to easily approach them and question their decisions. This was even seen inside the masjids, where the rulers would pray in their own curtained-off sections. A court system was also developed with a throne and a crown and an official seal. The governors also began to wear luxurious clothes and live in palaces far above the people. But there were many reasons for those decisions, and they weren't as nefarious as some people like to imagine. And most of them were taken with either security or state stability in mind. You see, Muawiyah had inherited an extremely volatile empire, and out of the last 5 rulers, 3 of them were assassinated, with 2 of the assassinations having taken place in the masjid during prayer. Muawiyah himself had been assassinated in the masjid, and so he decided to create a curtained-off section for himself and place a guard at the entrance. This was the reason he made the governors inaccessible to the people. There was always a fear that the people could attack them just as they had done with the previous caliphs. But then there was the issue of luxury and palaces, none of which had anything to do with security or with preventing attacks. Rather, when Muawiyah first began to govern Syria, he quickly realized that he was in a land that had been used to extravagance of the Romans. The people there did not respect those who were frugal. They saw them as stingy and poor and undeserving of respect. And then there were guests he would invite for diplomatic relations. They expected lavish gifts and luxurious palaces to host them. Luxury and opulence became one of the cornerstones of his diplomacy while he was dealing with the various nations between the Muslim lands and the Roman Empire. It was much cheaper and easier to bribe people than to go to war with them. And when diplomats and other nations saw him in expensive robes surrounded by an entourage of guards, they would rightfully assume that his military was also powerful and well organized. Appearances were everything. And so an elaborate court system was established. He wore a crown and sat on a throne and had people request a meeting with him in order for him to then give them an audience. The official seal was also important, considering how Uthman had been killed because of a fake document. No longer could letters be forged and fabricated as easily as before, and now the seal would stay in the court under the protection of the guards who stood on patrol each night. And as proof that these changes were made with the best of intentions, consider that Muawiyah had made many of these changes during the lifetime of Umar ibn al-Khattab. When Umar had appointed Muawiyah as the governor of Syria, he began hearing stories of his opulence and complaints that people could not easily reach him. And so he traveled to Syria personally to meet Muawiyah in person and question him on what he was doing. Umar asked him, "Muawiyah, were you the one with that grand procession just now, on top of what I've heard about people with needs being made to wait at your door?" Muawiyah replied, "Yes, Amir al-Mu'mineen." And so Umar asked, "Why is that?" Muawiyah answered, "Because we are in a land where the enemy's spies are many, and there must be something that strikes fear with the awe of the ruler. If you command me to do this, I'll keep it, and if you forbid me, I will stop." At that, Omar said, "If what you have said is true, then it is a shrewd policy. And if it is false, then it is a clever ruse. I neither command you nor forbid you." For the next 19 years, Muawiyah ruled over the Muslims from his capital city in Syria. And none of the Sahaba objected to his election, nor were there any rebellions throughout his entire rule. By far, he had the most stable and most successful reign out of any of his predecessors. He was a master politician and one of the greatest statesmen in all of history. Under his rule, the Muslims had a long-lasting peace. There were no civil wars, there were no uprisings, and the Muslims enjoyed their lives in great prosperity. Muawiyah also invested in developing the economy and building infrastructure around the Muslim world. Roads were laid and dams and bridges were built, and trade between the different lands boomed as caravans could travel in safety. And then there was the expansion of the empire as the Muslims continued their conquest into new territories. Under Muawiyah, the city of Qarawin was founded in Tunisia, becoming the administrative capital for the Muslim forces in the region. And at the same time, a proper navy was also developed, and the Muslims now began patrolling the seas and securing trade routes across the Mediterranean Sea. But as the years passed by, Muawiyah's age began to catch up with him, and the question of his succession began to arise. Who would be the next Khalifa after him? And what would happen to the Muslims? Would there be another civil war or a series of assassinations? Would the people of Syria refuse to relinquish power after they had lost so many men in the Battle of Siffin? And what if a member of Banu Hashim was chosen, the rival clan of Banu Umayya? Would there be a conflict between the two sides? After all, despite the rise of Islam, the issues of tribalism still continued to play a role in politics, and these things needed to be taken into account when choosing a new leader for the Muslims. All of these issues weighed down on Muawiyah as he knew his days were numbered. And from his experience throughout his 41 years of rule, he knew the chaos that would come after his death. So perhaps, to avoid another civil war from happening, he made the most controversial decision of his entire career. And while he may have thought it wise at the time, soon enough, the very decision he made would become the catalyst for what he was trying to prevent. And that decision, of course, was to choose his own son as the next Khalifa. And by doing so, he had set a precedent that nearly all rulers after him would follow. Now, Banu Umayya would become the permanent rulers, and their kingdom would become a dynasty. This is why some people call it the Umayyad Kingdom, a name to represent the fact that only one family now ruled over all others.
The Rise of Yazid ibn Muawiyah.
You will surely conquer Constantinople. What a wonderful commander and army. Yazid ibn Muawiyah was named after his uncle, the beloved older brother of Muawiyah, who had died from a plague during the Caliphate of Omar. And now that Muawiyah had chosen Yazid to succeed him on his throne, he had to find a way to convince the people to accept him. And what a better way to bring prestige to Yazid's name than to have a direct endorsement from the Prophet ﷺ himself. So Muawiyah decided to put Yazid at the head of his new navy. And he sent him off to the lands of the Romans, where he was to conquer their capital city. Now, the Muslims had done this before. In fact, the capital of the Muslims at that time was the city of Damascus, one of the greatest cities in the history of the world, and one that had been wrested from the hands of the Romans. And then there was the city of Ctesiphon, the capital city of the Persians. This was the empire that had matched the Romans in their civilization and power, but the Muslims had defeated them and taken the city for themselves. And now the entire empire was being ruled under the kingdom of Muawiyah. So why couldn't they take Constantinople too? And if Yazid were to lead the conquest, he would clearly be seen as a suitable successor to the throne. So the ships were then prepared and the navy was sent, and they traveled through the Mediterranean Sea until they reached the Dardanelles. But the Romans had a new weapon that they called Greek fire that they attached to their ships. These were giant flamethrowers that burned everything in front of them. Unable to survive these attacks, the Muslims were forced to land their ships and march to Constantinople on foot. Eventually their armies arrived and they managed to surround the capital city, but without any naval support, breaking through the city's defenses would be nearly impossible. Still, the Muslims attacked, and several times they tried to get through, but with each attempt the Romans attacked back and many people were killed in the battle. The most famous incident of this battle was the death of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. He was the Sahabi in whose house the Prophet ﷺ stayed when he first arrived in Medina. Now Abu Ayyub was nearly 80 years old, and during the battle he fell ill. And knowing that his life was coming to an end, he asked the Muslims to take him as close as they could to the fortress of the city. And soon he was put to rest beneath the walls of the Romans, far into the lands of the enemy, where no Muslim had been buried before. Yazid himself would lead his funeral prayer. As Constantinople grew over the centuries, it eventually extended beyond its original walls, and it encompassed Abu Ayyub's grave. Today there is a masjid to mark where his grave is, and it's in the neighborhood what's called Ayyub Sultan in Istanbul, the modern name, of course, of Constantinople. The first siege of the Roman capital would ultimately fail, and Yazid was forced to return to Damascus. He would not be the great conqueror of Constantinople that the Prophet ﷺ had foretold, but Muawiyah still needed to find a way to get the people to approve Yazid. So he made Yazid the emir of Hajj as a way to endear him to the people. For 3 years in a row, Yazid gave the khutbahs of Hajj and led the people in prayer. And during that time, Muawiyah would join him in Hajj and campaign for his candidacy, asking the people to pledge an oath of allegiance to his son while he was still their Khalifa. Of the people that gave their allegiance were Abdullah ibn Omar and Abdullah ibn Abbas. These were two sons of the great Sahaba, Omar and Abbas, and they were among the greatest scholars and leaders of their time. But many other sons of the great Sahaba either decided to remain neutral or outright reject Yazid. And among those were Abdullah ibn Zubayr and Hussein ibn Ali. A rift was now beginning to form, and the people of Medina were splitting off into two camps: those who would approve of Yazid's rise to power and those who would reject. But while Muawiyah was still alive, the Muslims would remain united, and this issue remained relatively unimportant. It was only when he died a few years later that the Muslims fell back into the throes of chaos. O Allah, do not let me live to see the year 60. O Allah, do not let me live to see the rule of the young men. This was a dua that Abu Huraira used to make frequently. And it was clear that the Prophet ﷺ had warned him about something. And this dua was ultimately accepted by Allah, as he would die in the year 59 Hijri, 1 year before. Muawiyah, on the other hand, died in 60 Hijri. And soon after, another prophecy would be fulfilled. The rule of the young men that Abu Huraira so feared would finally become a reality.
One of the biggest reasons why many people regularly don't read books is because they're often visually bland and boring. This is literally a medium that is visual only, yet authors are often so uncreative and so unimaginative that they never use any imagery to enhance their own stories. So that's why I've put a huge amount of effort into the visuals of this book, the entire history of Islam, so that every page oozes with emotion, and so that it adds depth and clarity to the stories. And also so that when people open up the book, they can actually enjoy the beauty of our history, not just in its stories, but in its visuals as well. Beauty is so important, to the point that even the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah is beautiful and that He loves beauty. So I am working with artists and I'm experimenting with all sorts of different colors and art styles and backgrounds and visuals to make sure that every page in this massive book will be absolutely spectacular. This is the most important book of our generation. So it needs to look as important as it truly is. If the presentation isn't done well, then nobody will look past it, even if the writing is worth its weight in gold. So go to my website and pre-order the book now. And if you pre-order, I will literally write your name into the book. An honor for you, because you were one of the very first people to support this project. Something special only for the people that pre-ordered. The funds I get from the pre-orders will then allow me to pay these artists and make sure that every page is extremely visually beautiful while also being easy to read. So go to my website now and pre-order the book. And may Allah fill your life with beauty. Ameen.
The beginning of the second Fitna.
When Muawiyah passed away after 41 years of ruling from Damascus, his son Yazid was then placed on the throne and crowned the Khalifa over all of the Muslims. But in order for him to solidify his claim, he would need the approval of the people. This meant going back to Medina and getting an oath of allegiance from their leaders. But when he arrived in Medina, he found the same split in opinion. One group of the Sahaba and their sons approved him, and the other group rejected him. Of those who approved Yazid was Abdullah ibn Umar, the son of Umar ibn Khattab, and Abdullah ibn Abbas, the son of Abbas, who was the uncle, of course, the Prophet ﷺ. Those who rejected Yazid were Abdullah ibn Zubayr, the son of Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, and Hussein ibn Ali, the son of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Abdullah ibn Umar was by far the most senior of them, and he had once even been suggested as the next Khalifa when his own father was on his deathbed. But Umar ibn Khattab refused to allow anyone else in his family to rule over the Muslims. Umar said, "It is enough for the house of al-Khattab that one man be held accountable before Allah for the affairs of the Muslims." Umar was undoubtedly on another level of piety, and his son Abdullah ibn Umar was known to follow closely in the footsteps of his father. Abdullah ibn Umar argued that Yazid had the army and he was clearly in power, and anyone who had sworn an oath to him while Muawiyah was still alive was still required to keep it. And if a consensus had been reached on who the Khalifa was, it now became obligatory to follow him even if he was oppressive. I'll be discussing the issue of obeying oppressive rulers and their legitimacy a little bit later in this video. The consensus he was referring to had clearly been reached in Damascus, but over there in Medina, there were still a few people who rejected Yazid. Abdullah ibn Zubayr and Hussein had a number of issues with accepting Yazid as the next Khalifa. Some of the issues had to do with the way that he was being elected. Others had to do with Yazid's qualifications as a pious and just ruler. First, there was the issue of the contract Muawiyah had signed when Hassan abdicated the throne. In that contract, Muawiyah had agreed that after he died, the choice of the next Khalifa would be given to the people. Then there was the issue of forcing the choice of the next leader down the people's throats. Yazid and his family were coming in and threatening anyone who did not support them. And while Muawiyah had been training Yazid in the arts of politics and warfare, Yazid had lived in the palaces of Damascus his entire life and was isolated from the masses. How could someone like this know justice and fairness when he had no real connection with the people? All of these factors concerned Abdullah bin Zubayr and Hussein, and so they refused to pledge their allegiance to him. But the situation for Hussein was particularly complicated because he was the son of Ali. It was not long ago that Ali had fought Muawiyah at the Battle of Siffin, and many people from Banu Umayya still blamed him for the tragedy. Some of them had even lost friends and family in the fighting, and they now harbored a resentment against Ali and his children. And a few of them began to curse him and his family, and even the rest of Banu Hashim. Among them was Marwan ibn al-Hakim, who had previously been the secretary of Uthman. He had been on Aisha's side against Ali during the Battle of the Camel, and under Muawiyah he was appointed the governor of Medina, and he ruled over Hassan and Hussein. And every Friday he would end his khutbahs by cursing Ali and his family in front of them. But he was eventually removed from his position, and Walid ibn Utbah, another member of the Banu Umayya, came in his place. And he too had a feud with Hussein, this time a land dispute. Eventually Hussein managed to fight for his rights and get his property back, but the relationship between the two remained bitter. And now that Yazid had succeeded his father, Marwan and Utbah saw an opportunity to get rid of Hussein once and for all. While the governors of Medina had feuds with Hassan and Hussein, it seemed that Muawiyah was on cordial terms with them. Every year he would send them the money and the gifts that he had promised to them, and he never denied them any of their rights. They called Yazid to Medina to get their oath of allegiance from the people, and in particular to question Abdullah ibn Zubayr and Hussein, and to kill them if they refused. One by one they were brought into a room and asked to swear their allegiance, but each one gave a diplomatic answer, saying it was better to give their oaths in public and not behind closed doors. So this was accepted from them, and they were told to come back in the morning so that they could swear their oaths in the masjid. But Abdullah ibn Zubayr and Hussein snuck out of the city and fled at night, knowing that Medina was no longer safe for them. When they entered the deserts, they then turned their horses towards the city of Mecca, a sanctuary for all people. There they would be safe under the protection of the Haram, a land that was deemed sacred by Allah, and all killing was forbidden.
ومن دخله كان آمنا.
The Massacre of Karbala.
The Prophet ﷺ woke up with red soil in his hand, which he was kissing. He said, Jibreel alayhi salam informed me that this one, Hussein, will be killed in the land of Iraq. And so I said to Jibreel, show me the soil of the land in which he will be killed. And this is the soil. The story of Karbala is one of the least authentically documented, yet most written about stories in all of the history of Islam. And while many early historians had attempted to preserve the details of what exactly happened, they often used narrations from known liars and fabricators, such as Muhammad ibn Umar al-Waqidi and Abu Mikhnaf al-Azdi. Abu Mikhnaf in particular wrote one of the earliest accounts of the story of Karbala in his book Maqtal Hussein. But this book was full of fabrications and exaggerations with very little trustworthy narration. But what makes the situation even more complicated is the fact that a second edition of this book was released some 400 years later. And in this second edition, written by an unknown author, the lies and the fabrications were exaggerated even more, and many new details were added, thus completely removing it from all historical accuracy. The second edition of this book is widespread today and has become the most popular source of information on Karbala that modern Sunni preachers and thinkers use unknowingly. But it is a fabrication of what actually happened. But despite all of this, there are some narrations that are more authentic than others. And from these few narrations, we can piece together a general picture of what happened, though the details still remain elusive. When Hassan left Kufa after abdicating the throne to Muawiyah, the people of Kufa would send letters to him asking him to come back and return to his place as their Khalifa. But eventually Hassan was poisoned, and now the letters were directed to Hussein. And now that Yazid was in power, the letters flooded in, calling on Hussein to return to their city. They promised him that they would support him against Yazid, as they believed he was the true successor to the Caliphate. And it seems to be that after spending some time in Mecca, Hussein began to consider moving to Kufa, being persuaded by these letters. And while the popular story says that all of his friends and family warned him not to go, none of these reports are actually authentic. Rather, we have reports that Abdullah ibn Umar and Abdullah ibn Abbas advised him against it, while Abdullah ibn Zubayr was in favor of it. Eventually, Hussein decided to send one of his close relatives, Muslim ibn Aqil, to go to Kufa ahead of him and to see if the Kufans were truthful. There, Ibn Aqil met with the leaders of Kufa, who all pledged their allegiance to Hussein. And so Ibn Aqil then sent a message to Hussein telling him what had happened and that the people would support him when he arrived. So Hussein then gathered around 70 of his closest relatives, and they all set off towards the city of Kufa. Soon word got out that Hussein was traveling to Kufa and that many of the Kufans even had left their city to go out and to meet him along his journey. But the Kufans weren't the only ones to notice this movement. Yazid and his spies soon discovered what was taking place in Kufa, and he sent Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad to replace the governor there and execute Muslim ibn Aqil. Ubaydullah then sent an army of around 4,000 men to block Hussein in his path. It mostly consisted of soldiers from Kufa, but its leaders were all from Damascus. There, they demanded that Hussein pledge allegiance to Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad directly, but Hussein refused, saying that he would travel to Yazid in Damascus and pledge his allegiance to him there directly instead. During this stalemate, it seems that the Kufans who had joined Hussein's caravan switched sides, and they went to the army of Ubaydullah. The letters they had sent to Hussein would incriminate them, so perhaps they abandoned him now, hoping to be forgiven for joining Hussein, and perhaps their lives would be spared. But eventually, this stalemate ended when the army attacked Hussein and his family. This was a caravan of civilians with women and children. They had no chance to fight back against 4,000 soldiers. But there are so many contradictory stories as to what exactly happened. One of the most famous of these stories is how Shimr ibn Dhil Jawshan was the one to kill Hussein. He was a man who had fought under the command of Ali in the Battle of Siffin, but now he had betrayed Ali's son and joined the other side. And although the rest of the story is likely true, in reality Shimr most likely was not the one to deliver the final blow to Hussein. That dishonor goes to a man by the name of Sinan ibn Anas, who admitted to killing him with his own sword and spear. Sinan ibn Anas, the killer of Hussein, entered upon Hajjaj. Al-Hajjaj then asked, "Are you the one who killed Hussein?" Sinan said, "Yes." Al-Hajjaj asked, "How did you do it?" Sinan replied, "I speared him and struck him with a sword." Al-Hajjaj said, "You two will never be together in the same place in the Akhirah." This was one of the greatest tragedies the ummah had ever seen. The beloved grandson of the Prophet ﷺ now lay dead on the red soil of Iraq, just as the Prophet ﷺ had prophesied. And even though Yazid and Banu Umayya were in power at the time, the people saw the Kufans were to blame, as they had led Hussein into a trap and killed him with their own swords. A man asked Abdullah ibn Umar about the blood of mosquitoes. Ibn Umar said, "From where are you?" The man replied, "From Iraq." Ibn Umar said, "Look at that. He's asking me about the blood of mosquitoes while they, the Iraqis, have killed the grandson of the Prophet. I have heard the Prophet ﷺ saying, they, Hassan and Hussein, are my two sweet-smelling flowers in this world." Many people tried to cover for Yazid and put all of the blame on Abdullah ibn Ziyad and the people of Kufa. They say that there's no proof that Yazid ordered this and that Hussein had been willing to swear his allegiance to him. But this cannot absolve Yazid of all guilt, as these men reported to him directly. He had been the one to appoint these men, and he had set the events in motion. And in the end, he did not punish Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad for what he had done. After the massacre, the army then took the survivors of the caravan and brought them to Kufa. And the head of Hussein was then cut off from his body and delivered to Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad on a silver plate. But as the surviving family of Hussein had been paraded through the streets of Kufa, they saw the people wailing and screaming, tearing their garments apart, scratching their faces and striking their cheeks. According to Shia sources, when Ali ibn Hussein, also known as Zayn al-Abidin, who had survived the massacre, saw this, he rebuked them, saying, "These people are weeping over us, but who killed us other than them?" This became the tradition of some of the people of Kufa, and it even continues on with some Shia traditions even until today. There's a misconception that this event was the catalyst of the splitting of Shi'ism from the rest of the Islamic world. However, Shi'ism actually developed its own theology and traditions long after this event. So I'll be discussing more on Shi'ism and its origin when I get to the video on the Abbasid Caliphate.
The destruction of Medina.
My father told me that there will be a ram by whom Mecca's sanctity will be violated. I do not wish to be that ram. Hussein ibn Ali. If this narration is true, then what Ali was saying to his son, Hussein, was that there would be a man in Mecca whose presence in the city would cause the sanctity of the Haram to be violated. This may have been one of the reasons why Hussein chose to leave Mecca, fearing that his enemies would come for him and massacre all those who tried to protect him. But Hussein was ultimately killed outside of Mecca, and the Haram's sanctity remained unviolated. So if this were a true prophecy that Ali had heard from the Prophet ﷺ, then in order for it to be fulfilled, another man would have to come and be the cause of the bloodshed. Little did Abdullah ibn Zubayr know, he would be that man. Initially, Abdullah ibn Zubayr had fled from Yazid at the same time as Hussein, and they ended up in Mecca together. He was also one who advised Hussein to leave, thinking that he would find support among the people of Kufa. But when the news arrived from Karbala that Hussein and his family had been massacred, the people of Mecca and Medina were shocked. Never could they have imagined that Yazid would commit such a crime. Dozens of the al-Bayt, the family of the Prophet ﷺ, were killed in an instant, and he was the one responsible. And so the people of Mecca, they went to Abdullah ibn Zubayr and they gave him their oaths of allegiance. And soon after, the people of Medina followed them, abandoning Yazid and the Umayyads. This was a declaration of war against Yazid, and they knew what was going to follow. Now the two cities began to raise their armies in preparation for another war. But to Yazid's credit, he sent one of the Ansar of the Prophet ﷺ to go to Medina and to try to reason with the people. But the people of Medina were set on avenging Hussein, and they were now preparing for a rebellion. So Yazid understood that war was inevitable, and he began his own preparations as well. The following year, Yazid's army was ready, and they marched towards Medina. And when they arrived in the city, they were to give the people 3 days to decide their fate. If they surrendered within that time, the people would be forgiven. But if they decided to fight, then the army would be given permission for 3 days to do whatever it pleased. This was the city of the Prophet ﷺ that they were now surrounding, and in it many of his Sahaba still lived. What Yazid was threatening had never been done in the history of the ummah. He was talking about killing and pillaging and violating the women. Who could have imagined that these threats would come true? But Yazid had already shown his true colors in the massacre of Karbala. The days now counted down, one after the other, but the people of Medina refused. They believed that they were on the truth and that they were ready to fight, but soon they would realize they made a huge mistake. On the 4th day, the two armies lined up outside the gates of the city, but Yazid's army was several times larger and much better equipped, and they simply crushed the Medinans in an overwhelming attack. Quickly, Yazid's army entered the city, and for the next 3 days, they killed and tortured thousands of people. Babies were ripped from the hands of their mothers and decapitated, while countless women were violated in horrendously vile attacks. The sanctity of the city had been completely desecrated, and the people of Medina suffered an unbelievable fate. This was supposed to be a fellow Muslim army, but in those 3 days they lost all of their humanity, and will leave them to Allah to decide how they will fare on the day of judgment. This battle was known as the Battle of al-Harra, and it shook the ummah with an unbelievable shaking. But everyone knew that this was only the beginning, as the great city of Mecca was still standing in defiance. The writing was on the wall. The sacred Haram was next. Does anyone who believes in Allah and the last day love Yazid?
How could Muslims commit such crimes?
When I first read about this story, how Muslims committed such egregious crimes, even in the sacred city of Medina, and even against other Muslims, I was genuinely shocked. Never would I have expected that Muslims could stoop to such low levels, though perhaps this was because I had an idealistic perception of Muslim history and not a realistic one. I had believed that Muslims throughout history acted with perfect respect to the law and carried pure and moral hearts in their chests that would never allow them to oppress others. I thought that the crimes that the Muslims committed all around us today were somehow unique to this modern era that we lived in today. But the story of Islam really is the story of humanity. In it, you will see times of war and times of peace, times of chaos and of freedom, and times of oppression and times of justice. You will find moments of greatness and glory when the Muslims chose Allah and Islam over all else, and they spread justice across the lands. But you will also find those moments of despair and darkness when the Muslims have oppressed each other and corruption began to sow its seeds in the land. This moment here, this sacking of Medina right after the killing of Hussein, indeed is one of the darkest moments in all of Islamic history. But these were not our crimes, and we will not be asked about them on the day of judgment. Rather, those who committed their crimes on that day will have to stand in front of Allah on their own. And even if they weren't punished for them in this life, they will certainly be held accountable in the next.
ولا تحسبن الله غافلا عما يعمل الظالمون إنما يؤخرهم ليوم تشخص فيه الأبصار.
For context, however, the actions of Yazid's army were not unique at the time, as it was an acceptable practice in the ancient world to give no quarter when conquering a city that didn't immediately surrender. This was a way for kings to warn their enemies not to fight back, but it was also a way to incentivize their soldiers to risk their lives in search of spoils and plunder. These soldiers were often on the road for months or even years without enjoying the company of their wives. And so just like feeding meat to animals, the conquered women would be given to those soldiers as spoils of war in order to keep their soldiers from rebelling. This is the grotesque nature of war and has been a part of the human experience since the very beginning of time. And when I read these stories repeated again and again in every single civilization, I soon realize how vastly different the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba were to the rest of those civilizations. Never has a generation of people fought wars with such mercy and care towards the enemy. Never have we seen such humanity on the battlefield that when the Prophet ﷺ conquered Mecca, the entire city was left untouched and forgiven. It was one of the greatest conquests in all of history, and yet it was completely bloodless. And many of those who were conquered that day went on to fight alongside him in future battles. The Prophet ﷺ was completely different to any other human being in history. Never did he give in to his desires and oppress his enemies. And his Sahaba, his companions, stood behind him and obeyed him in his commands, waging a war against their own souls so that they wouldn't go beyond the limits that Allah had set. There is no one like the Prophet ﷺ and no generation like the Sahaba. They were so unique and so special. And that's why we take them as our role models above anyone else. And no matter how many crimes and sins the Muslims have committed throughout history, the religion of Islam stands alone, perfected by Allah Himself. You Muslims will surely follow the mistakes of the nations before you, span by span and inch by inch. Even if they entered a lizard's hole, you would follow them.
The Caliphate of Abdullah ibn Zubayr.
With the people of Medina having now been subdued and the city now back under the control of the Umayyads, Yazid's army began to march towards Mecca. And there they surrounded the city, beginning the dreadful siege of the sacred Haram. For 2 months they pelted the city with stones, launching giant boulders from catapults and bombarding the people of Mecca. And in order to protect the Kaaba, the people constructed a large wooden structure over it, but it ultimately caught fire and burned down, and the Kaaba was severely damaged along with it. But while this was happening, Yazid suddenly passed away, and the Umayyad authority over the Muslims collapsed almost instantaneously. The army that was besieging Mecca then began negotiations with Abdullah ibn Zubayr, and eventually they packed their bags and left Mecca alone, choosing to return back to Syria and assess the situation. Yazid left behind many sons, but only one of them was old enough to rule. This was Muawiyah II, a young man in his 20s, but he was chronically ill and he preferred a life of asceticism. He was a righteous man who hated the dirty world of politics, and within a few months he went out to the people and he announced that he was abdicating the throne. By Allah, I have not tasted the sweetness of your caliphate, so why should I now drink its bitterness? At this, he revived the sunnah of Umar ibn Khattab, and he appointed a council of 6 righteous leaders to choose the next Khalifa. He then returned to his room and shut the door, and he was never seen from again. The council then appointed a man by the name of Al-Dhahhak ibn Qais al-Fihri to lead them in Damascus, and soon he became convinced that the right thing to do would be to pledge allegiance to Abdullah ibn Zubayr. All the other provinces of the Muslim world had already begun pledging their allegiance. It was time for the province of Syria to join them as well and to reunite the ummah. And for a moment there, it seemed as if the war had now reached its end, and Abdullah ibn Zubayr would come out victorious. Even the people of Damascus were now swearing their allegiance, accepting him as the rightful Khalifa. The terrible reign of Yazid was now over, and perhaps the days of peace would return to the people. But this hope would not last long. Marwan ibn al-Hakam and some of the other Umayyad governors met together in the town of Ajabiyya to discuss what to do about the situation. With the killing of Hussein and the massacre of Medina and the siege of Mecca, they knew that their crimes had been too great and that they would be killed for their participation. So Marwan decided to gather his own army and claim the caliphate for himself. He then challenged the Dhahhak in Damascus and fought a battle against him, with the Umayyad loyalties fighting on both sides of the war. This was known as the Battle of Marj Rahit, and the Umayyads under Marwan decisively defeated the Umayyads under Al-Dhahhak. Al-Dhahhak himself was killed in the fighting. He had kept his oath to Abdullah ibn Zubayr until the very end, and he had sacrificed his life for the sake of uniting the Muslims. Marwan ibn al-Hakam was in control of Damascus now, and he quickly began a new campaign to reconquer the Muslim world. First, he went to the lands of Iraq, and he regained some control over the region. He then went to Egypt and secured the province under his new kingdom. The balance of power was beginning to shift back towards the Umayyads, and Abdullah ibn Zubayr was slowly being encircled. But then, all of a sudden, Marwan ibn al-Hakam passed away, and his son Abdul Malik ibn Marwan took over his throne. But this was not the only surprise to take place that year. Rather, from the ashes of Kufa, a new army began to rise. And all of a sudden, the battle was no longer just between Abdullah ibn Zubayr and the Umayyads, but now a third group had risen up, claiming the caliphate for themselves.
The Tawwabbun.
After the killing of Hussein by the Kufan people, a number of elders from the city began to grieve for Hussein, regretting what they had allowed to happen. These were all people who had sent letters to Hussein, inviting him to Kufa in the first place. But now that he had passed away, they began meeting in secret, discussing amongst themselves how they could avenge his death and take down the Umayyad dynasty. The name of this group was the Tawwabbun, meaning the people who had turned in repentance. Their leader was a man by the name of Sulaiman ibn Surad, and over the next few years he preached to the people, saying that Allah would only forgive them if they sacrificed their lives and fought against the tyrannical Umayyads. Through his preaching, he managed to gather an army of 17,000 people, and when Yazid finally died, he saw an opportunity and declared war on Damascus. But when his people saw that he was actually serious in his intentions, most of them abandoned him, and his army dwindled to only 3,000 in number. Nonetheless, he was determined to carry out his mission, and he began to march to meet his death in Syria, where he would soon find the Umayyads. At the time, Marwan ibn al-Hakim was still alive, and he was busy trying to reconquer Iraq. This is when the two armies met, and the Umayyads completely destroyed them in Battle of Ain al-Warda. Most of the Tawwabbun were killed in the fighting, but those who survived fled back to Kufa, where they joined another man in his mission, and that man was Mukhtar Al-Thaqafi, a charismatic rebel against the Umayyad dynasty.
Mukhtar Al-Thaqafi.
When Hussein originally sent his cousin Muslim ibn Aqil to Kufa to see if the people were truthful, Mukhtar Al-Thaqafi had been one of those to host him, letting him secretly live in his own house. But after Muslim ibn Aqil was eventually executed by the governor of Kufa, Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, Mukhtar Al-Thaqafi was then arrested and put into prison. And that's when the events of Karbala happened, and Hussein and his family were all killed as well. Eventually, however, Mukhtar Al-Thaqafi was released from prison when Abdullah ibn Omar appealed to the authorities on his behalf. Mukhtar then traveled to Mecca and helped Abdullah ibn Zubayr defend the city against Yazid's army. But Mukhtar was charismatic and well-connected, and he was ambitious for power. And while he was in Mecca, he began butting heads with Abdullah ibn Zubayr, trying to outmaneuver him politically. Eventually, the two had a falling out, and Mukhtar was forced to leave the city. So he decided to go to Medina, where other opportunities lay. The idea was that he would go back to Kufa and raise a new army to avenge the killing of Hussein. But in order to do that, he would need the support of one of Hussein's surviving relatives in Medina. First, he went to Hussein's son, Zayn al-Abidin, but he rejected the idea outright, not wanting to be involved in more violence. But then there was Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya, the brother of Hassan and Hussein from a different mother, and he neither approved nor disapproved Mukhtar's plan. All Muhammad asked was that more bloodshed would be avoided. And so with this, Mukhtar took it as an endorsement and went back to Kufa, where he began raising a new army in Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya's name. But this is where Mukhtar Al-Thaqafi began to speak about a number of strange ideas. He began to claim to the Kufans that Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya was the Mahdi, and that Mukhtar himself was working on behalf of him, thus making him the representative of al-Bayt. But his lies didn't stop there, and he only continued to exaggerate the story. Eventually, he began to claim that he was a prophet who was being given revelation from the angel Jibreel alayhi salam himself. Soon news of Mukhtar Al-Thaqafi spread around the region, and thousands of people flocked to Kufa to support him on his mission. But this was blatant kufr that he was saying in Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya's name, and so Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya prepared to travel to Kufa himself and reveal Mukhtar as a fraud. But Mukhtar was a manipulative genius, and he began to spread a message to his people, and he said that one of the signs that Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya was the Mahdi was the miraculous fact that he could not be killed by swords. And with that, he now had thousands of people who were willing to try and slice him. They wanted to see if this miracle was true and if Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya would actually survive. And so with that, Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya decided to stay in Medina and not risk his life. Mukhtar was then able to take over Kufa with the help of his followers. And a few weeks later, they fought the Battle of Khazir, leaving the Umayyad army dead on the battlefield. These were the people who had killed Hussein and massacred the people of Medina. Mukhtar kept his promise and he avenged Hussein's killing. And even the governor who had decapitated Hussein now had his own head removed from his body. But while he had told one truth, with it came many lies, and he continued to call himself a prophet to his people. This was now well beyond ordinary politics, as he was deceiving the people and twisting the message of Islam. And so Abdullah ibn Zubayr sent an army from the city of Basra to recapture Kufa. And there they fought the battles of Madar and Harura against him. And in the end, the forces of Abdullah ibn Zubayr were victorious, and they surrounded Mukhtar in the great palace of Kufa. And for 4 months, he and his men held out in the palace until eventually he was captured and executed. After the death of Mukhtar Al-Thaqafi, he was seen as a martyr by his followers, and from them, a new religious movement known as the Qaysaniya emerged. This was a proto-Shia sect that invented the idea of imama, where the descendants of Ali were considered imams of the ummah that came one after another. This was the end of Mukhtar Al-Thaqafi, the avenger of Hussein and his family. But how sad the story must end when his lies eventually caught up with him. But now that Abdullah ibn Zubayr had been responsible for his killing, another man would soon rise up and seek his revenge. He was a fellow tribesman of Mukhtar from the tribe of Banu Thaqif, a man who would become infamous as the tyrant of Iraq. In Thaqif, there is a liar and a destroyer. The liar has already been defeated. The destroyer was soon to come.